In many ways, we live in the age of ciphers. And by ciphers, I mean things which are easy to project upon. People who are all ethos, no pathos, no logos, to use the Aristotelian triad. All the appearance of credibility, no community, no proof of competence. Our competence only in a limited field, but almost as in Murphy's Law, constantly pushing beyond the possibility of their specialized subject knowledge. We see this in presidents. We see this everywhere. But the cipher as a political figure and as a figure of social justice is always a problem. People who listen to me know that I think justice is an emotive word, a purely emotive word, meaning it often is a cipher. For justice to be meaningful beyond some vague primate notion of fairness, which most social mammals have, justice needs to be rooted in something, rooted in a shared set of values and material conditions. This is why I tend to promote virtue ethics, because it gets around the problems of impossible deontologies on one hand, which require you to share a metaphysical and epistemological universe for them to be meaningful. And utilitarian calculuses on the other, which run into all kinds of absurd paradoxes and unintended consequences. Plus, the whole idea that you can calculate utility in and of itself kind of assumes the question, doesn't it? I've been thinking a lot about justice, though. That throwing the concept out to a group of people who have been raised on it as the primary framework of their appeals is like throwing out appeals to integrity. Our appeals to authenticity. These abstracts don't mean a whole lot. Integrity means wholeness. Authenticity means true to yourself. Well, that would require you to know what that was. And it would require you to have a consistent self to be true to. There are all kinds of assumptions in these concepts that we let wash out. But they are so rooted in the way we speak. When Marxists, for example, chastised Chilean socialists for talking about workers' dignity, the workers responded to the appeals to dignity, and the Marxists were kind of confused. And so I am in a conundrum about justice. Social justice moved from an idea of social welfare in the early 20th century, largely promoted by, frankly, bourgeois and déclassé academics and intellectia who had a lot more times in their hands, who wanted to pick up the rules of the Judeo-Christian tradition, a portmanteau word that doesn't have a lot of meaning once you know the difference in Judeo-Christian ethics, but nonetheless, that's what they thought they were doing. The social gospel evolves into social welfare, evolves into social justice. This was picked back up in community movements in the 60s and 70s. And it became the language going through the academy when those movements went back into the academy in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. If you don't believe me, look at the career of Angela Davis or Adrienne Rich. People who either came from a very stodgy world like Adrienne Rich or a very communist world like Angela Davis, but ended up together at colloquiums in the 90s. And that language became the language, the assumed language, not just a critical theory, but of elite discourse. But in some ways, in not having a clear set of virtues, a clear set of articulations, with just whiffs of notions of human rights, as if that was obvious. And with people who beheld cultural relativism to the extent that the appeal to universal human rights didn't even make that much sense, yet they would still do it selectively and strategically as a kind of strategic essentialism. Well, this hollowed out justice too. So social justice becomes the gust of popular sentiment. And it brings up my pre Marxist, pre leftist Nietzschean suspicions that this is really just about power or revenge. And I'm not interested in revenge. I'm not interested in a fair world over the past. I'm interested in everyone being able to be fully who they are, not blinded by the caprice of birth into whatever class, because that caprice is unnecessary. That has been my vision, but I wouldn't call it justice because it is not fair. I cannot fix the past. I cannot redeem it, nor would I try to. But in the age of ciphers, these things have a lot of meaning. And I call it the age of ciphers for a reason. I've been talking more about ideas that I get from Byung-Chul Han. Now, I have a lot of criticism from Byung-Chul Han. I feel like his work is often short provocations towards theory. That his initial provocation is interesting and even insightful, but often the facts or readings that he gives off of it are sloppy, are undercooked. And because they are so insightful and pithy and are kind of like the critical theory version of a airport book, where he does have real insight and there is real reading there, but he doesn't develop it enough. It ends up being partial theory. Some people say pseudo theory. I almost think it's proto theoretical, but it really doesn't matter. Call it what you want. It feels incomplete. But he got me thinking a lot about the way this image stuff works with self and other, and it as an inhibitor to both a historical sense of the past and the future. And also why these appeals to social justice just don't mean that much. They become fads. And that is deleterious to any notion of justice being employed for political ends. And justice, unlike many of the other virtues that we talk about, is not solely and cannot be solely personal. It must be public. It must be communal. And in some ways, even beyond the realm of law, it must be political. This is not true for morality, and not entirely true for ethics. Now, the hard distinction between those things, you can debate with me all day. And like many things I talk about, there aren't strong demarcation lines. Like there aren't strong demarcation lines between norms and descriptions, because you use norms to articulate your descriptions. You do. Ignoring the language and models which you describe the world leads you to take those models as more real than they are. But to get beyond the justice of cipher, we have to really dig into how we got here and what it actually means. And I have 3 texts I'm reading from today to kind of help us out. You're going to notice these Varn vlog solos are more reflective, more contemplative, more purely educational, theoretical. And the reason why is that's what this medium is good for. Anyway, let's get into it. This is from the voice chapter in The Expulsion of Other by Byung-Chul Han. The voice comes from elsewhere, from outside, from the other. The voices one hears eludes localization. Now, this is me interjecting here. This reminds me a lot of the concept of dialogics from Bakhtin, but we're not doing Bakhtin today. Derrida's famous argument on the phonocentrism of Western metaphysics, which sees in the voice a privileged place of immediate self-presence and special proximity to meaning, to the logos, completely misses the exteriority of the voice. Yes, it does. That's actually an insightful comment from Byung-Chul Han. Like the gaze, something that we got from film criticism and psychoanalysis, unfortunately. It is a medium that precisely undermines self-presence, self-transparency, and inscribes the entirely other, the unknown, the uncanny into the self. And imagine when you think yourself is your voice. Even in our metaphors about politics, we give voice to the voiceless. We externalize the interior. We make the private public, but in terms of presentation, often confusing the two. This can open you up to all kinds of projections and ciphers. Living in a world where your material reality, being as bleak as it might feel to you, can be escaped to, not in television, not in passive consumption anymore, but in active construction of niches being fed back to you by algorithm. And that is neither good nor bad. It is easy to go full Ezra Klein, moderate end of the intellectual dark web, Jonathan Haidt, that just the algorithm's tearing us apart. It is doing that, but it's doing that partly because in some deeper sense, we want it. The algorithm feeds us the bullshit that we want, but it changes our neurochemistry in doing so. So eventually it's the only bullshit we want. No, let's continue with Byung-Chul Han. Kafka's story, for example, Before the Law of the Castle, subjectively staged negativity, the inaccessibility, the secret of the entirely other, which eludes all representation, the complete other, having no tie to the self or anything like the self, no analogy to you, is not articulatable. Lovecraft, of all people, always played with this. The man from the country waits until his death before the door to the law, yet is never admitted. The law remains closed to him. Nor does the land surveyor K gain admittance to the castle. It is no coincidence that the castle first manifests itself as a voice. It is the locus of the entirely other. After his arrival in the village, K makes a telephone call to the castle. What he hears on the telephone is no intelligible word, no speaking, no discourse, but rather an eerie, unintelligible singing from a distance. Long quote from Kafka. The mouthpiece came humming, the likes of which Kay had never heard on the telephone before. It was as though the humming of countless childlike voices, but it wasn't humming either. It was singing, the singing of the most distant, most utterly distant voices, as though a single high-pitched yet strong voice had emerged out of this humming in some quite impossible way and now drummed against one's ear as if demanding to penetrate more deeply into something other than one's wretched hearing. Kay listened without telephoning. His arm left propped on the telephone. He stands. He listened thus. The voice penetrates the deep layer below the level of consciousness. The gaze has its same intensity and deep effect. The mysterious barmaid Frida has a gaze of exceptional superiority. It penetrates the sphere of the conscious actions. It communicates the other within the eye and the eye within the other. One quote from Kafka again. When the gaze descended upon K, it seemed to him to be a gaze that had already decided matters concerning him, whose existence he still knew nothing about, but whose existence that gaze now convinced him. The voice, too, undermines self-presence. It has a deep fissure within the subject that allows the entirely other to interrupt, IRRUPT, the self, not interrupt, interrupt. In short, the investigation of a dog, Kafka describes the awe-inspiring voice which made the forest fall silent. and makes the listener become beside himself. Quote from Kafka. And I was really completely beside myself. In normal circumstances, I would have been gravely ill, incapable of moving, but I couldn't resist the melody, which the dog soon appeared to take over for himself. For Kafka, the voice is preferred medium for the other, the entirely other. Only a weakness, a metaphysical weakness, a primary passivity makes us receptive to the voice of the other. We also actually see this theme in Lovecraft. All his characters are confronted with the other in utter passivity. Anyway, back to Byung-Chul Han here. In the letter to Melina, Kafka compares the prophets to weak children who hear the voice calling them and felt fear tearing through their brain. They were weak in face of the tremendous voice of the other. The eroticism of the voice also lies in the fact it prevents the psychological subject from being reinforced. The voice makes it weak, and then it disappears. The voice causes the loss of the self. We often talk of justice as if it is a voice which speaks to us all and of whom we can give voice. But justice does not mean anything as entirely other. Justice is meaningless when it is utterly other, because the other is not experienced as a public, as a communal experience. It has no reciprocity to you. It does not care. The awe of God is because God is so above you in Judeo-Christian thought that you tremble in awe. It is awesome in both senses of the term, as in inspiring and as in terrifying. We live in such a godless world, and I don't particularly mourn it. And I don't think it is always modern either. But nonetheless, we do. You might not, but most of us do. Let's get back to Byung-Chul Han. Today, we are no longer weak children. Children's childlike weakness as receptiveness to the other is not keeping with the constitution of narcissistic society. Byung-Chul Han sounds like Christopher Lasch. The increasingly strengthened ego, nurtured and exploited by neoliberal conditions of production. I'm going to bypass the fact that I think that Byung-Chul Han does this Christopher Lasch thing in a superficial way, but we'll get back there. Because I'm like, explain how this is, narcissism and neoliberalism are directly connected in the way that Lasch tried to, and the minimal self, where he saw the beginnings of neoliberalism and talked about the move from type 2 narcissism to type 1 narcissism, to use the classic Freudian categorizations. Anyway, back here. The increasingly strengthened ego, nurtured and exploited by neoliberal conditions of production, is more and more isolated from the other. The proliferating ego is entirely impervious to the voice of the other. The narcissistic overload of the self-righteousness makes us completely deaf and blind to the other. We no longer perceive the other's voice amid the digital noise of the same. We have become resistant to the voice engage. For Kafka, the voice engage are also signs of the body. A communication devoid of these body signs is merely an exchange with ghosts. Ontology rears its ugly head yet again. Quote, how did people ever get the idea that they could communicate with another by letter? One thinks about someone far away and one can hold on to someone nearby, but everything else is beyond human power. Long ellipses. Written kisses never arrive at their destination. The ghosts drink them up along the way. Digital means of communicating are far more disembodied than letters. Handwriting is still bodily signs. Digital writing is the same. Most of all, digital media allied the other as a counterpart. They actually rob us of the ability to think about someone far away and hold someone nearby. They replace closeness and distance with gaplessness. Roland Barthes speaks of the grain of the voice to describe the corporality of the voice, which elides all forms of representation, both imagining and meaning. Thus, the deeper bodily layer does not mean anything, but it causes sensual pleasure. Long quote from Roland Barthes. Something is there, manifest and stubborn, one hears only that, beyond or before the meaning of the words, something which is directly the cantor's body, the singer in Jewish tradition, brought to your ears in one and the same movement from deep down in the cavities, the muscles, the membranes, the cartilage, although a single skin lined the inner flesh of the performer and the music he sings. Barthes distinguishes between the phonosong and the genosong. The grain of divorce inherent in the genosong, where the concern is not meaning, not signified, but rather the voluptuousness of its sound signifiers. This pleasure has little to do with meaning. It communicates itself corporally. The body relates to genosong as erotic, and it seduces. This seductive power is absent from the phonosong, however, which is dedicated to structure, to rules, to communication, to representation and expression. Here is the soul which accompanies the song, not the body. The phonosong, neither tongue nor membranes are audible. It brings about only sense, whereas the genosong puts the sensual into sound. The phonosong lacks corporality, sensuality. In the genosong, the concern is to patinate, to consonants, too readily thought to the very armature of our language and always prescribed to needing to be articulated, detached, emphasized in order to fulfill the clarity of meaning. That's from Barthes. In the genosong, consonants become simply springboards for admirable vowels. Vowels inhabit the voluptuous body. They're about your movement of your mouth. That's me talking. When I used to teach English, I became really aware of my vowels because I'm a Southerner, and Southerners basically have one vowel, and it's all Billy a diphthong of ah or eh. And how long you hold it really decides the vowel. Now I'm going to speak normally and not mimic my own accent, which I lost many years ago, except in keywords like water. But nonetheless, you can hear it. The truth of the language lies not in its functionality, clarity, expressivity, and communication, however, in its voluptuousness and seduction. Now, I wish I agreed with Byung-Chul Han and Varn on this. I think there is a oversplitting of the difference between the phonosong and the genosong, and in reality, our experience of that is all interrelated. But what does this have to do with ciphers and justice? The cipher works because you have no knowledge of anything but its form, its rules, its formality, its appearance, its ethos. It is both familiar to you in form, but removed from othering, so you do not treat it as foreign and separate from you, and thus you can project upon it what you need it to be. This brings me to another reading. I feel almost like I'm giving a Davar Torah or a homily and reading scriptures, but I don't think these are scriptures at all. I would be perfectly willing to tell these books apart. But maybe that's what these solos actually kind of are. Is me clarifying my thought through preaching so I can then write about it. I think through my voice. I think through the phonosong. And then I write. Not the other way around. Most people operate the other way around. I don't. It actually is really frustrating for me personally. Trust me, all my editors hate it. It makes me writing prose forever. But anyway, it's part of why I'm a poet. Back to the work here. This is from the Towards the Critique of Violence full critical edition by Walter Benjamin. Or Walter Benjamin. I've always been confused by people who say Walter Benjamin. Like, why would you... This is totally unrelated, but why would you pronounce the first name not in the ethnicity, Walter, and not pronounce the second name, and pronounce the second name ethnically Benjamin as opposed to Benjamin? But you already said Walter Benjamin. Should be Walter Benjamin. Conceptions of English are always weird. What ways where we insist on trying to overpronounce things or not anglicize them, and where we don't. people would, get mad at me as a freshman in high school when I'd read just The Stranger, and I was a young working class kid trying out for the academic team because, and I would say Albert Camus, and then other people would say Albert Camus, and they would get credit for it, but I get dinged because I said Camus, but we both mispronounced his first name in French. Anyway, neither here nor there. Maybe that's why I butcher French to this day. I don't know. Sorry, French people. All right. Benjamin. From the first part of the critical edition of Towards a Critique of Violence. And now we get to justice. Notes towards the work on the category of justice. To every good, limited as it might be by the semiotemporal order, or the spatial temporal order. By the way, that means literally from German what we were calling in Bakhtin the chronotope. It's spatial temporal, or temporal spatial. The chronotope is just temporal spatial as opposed to translating it here as spatial temporal, but they're probably even almost the same word. They both come from Einstein. That's where Bakhtin got it from. That's where Benjamin probably got it from too. Anyway, back to this. To every good, limited as it is by the spatial temporal order, there accrues a possession character as the expression of its transience. But the possession, as something caught in the same finitude, is always unjust. Why is that, Benjamin? Why is possession, as called in the same finitude, unjust? No order of possession, however articulated, can therefore lead to justice. Rather, this lies in the condition of the good that cannot be a possession. This alone is the good to whom goods become possessionless. We get the beginnings of the nascent ethics of communism we see in Benjamin. But we already have a problem here. We have to agree on what good is. And we do not. For reasons that we should have a heuristic of suspicion about. Every socialist or communist theory misses its goal precisely because of the claim that the individual wages over every good. If, for individual A, there's a need Z that can be satisfied with good X, and if one therefore believes that good Y, which is equal to good X, may and should be justifiably to the individual B in order to calm the same need, one errs. For there is an entirely abstract claim of the subject in principle to every good, a claim that in no way leads back to the needs, but rather to justice. Again, justice here is unyet defined, whose ultimate direction does not point towards the possession right of the person, but possibly towards the good right of the good. Justice is the striving to make the world into the highest good, Ficum alone. But this is almost rooted in a Jewish conception of the world. And not seeing that can be problematic when reading this period of Benjamin. Anyway, the aforementioned thoughts lead to this conjecture. Justice is not a virtue amongst other virtues. Humility, love of neighbor, loyalty, bravery. And I would agree with that. And we'll talk about why in a minute. Rather, it is a grounds of a new ethical category that one must perhaps not call a category of virtue, but rather a category of the same order as virtue. Remember, virtue is power. Virtue, power. Justice does not appear to refer to the goodwill of the subject, but instead constitutes a state, Zustand, of the world. Justice designates an ethical category of an existent virtue, the ethical category of the demanded. Virtue can be demanded. Justice in the final analysis can only be as a state of the world or as a state of God. In God, all virtues have the form of justice. The prefix omni is omnigracious, omniscient, and so forth points in this direction. Only the fulfillment of the demanded can be virtuous. Only a guarantee, their liston, of the existent, no longer perhaps to be determined through demands, nevertheless in any case not any arbitrary one, can be just. Justice is the ethical side of battle. Justice is a power mocked, mocked. Like the horrible Arbeitet macht frei. Work will make you free. Doing, mocked, to make. Of virtue and virtue of power. The responsibility for the world we have to protect from instances of justice. The Lord's Prayer, lead us not into temptation, but redeem us from evil. Separate words unreadable in the original text, is a prayer for justice, for the just state of the world. The empirical individual act is related to the moral law, somehow non-reducible to the fulfillment of a formal schema. Conversely, law, recht, right, is related to justice, Gerechtigkeit, as schemas to fulfillment. Other languages have designated an enormous gulf that essentially separates law from justice. And we have notes here from Greek and from Hebrew. Themis, mashpat, daika, sedect. Law and justice are not the same. This is Benjamin between his communism and idealism. But we see here the problem of justice in this articulation. Justice cannot just be virtue. It has to be beyond virtue, or at least in the same category as virtue. Virtues are collections of goods which we have agreed upon. Societies have virtues. They are modeled. They are powers that are modeled. They are both consequential and that you know them from their results, and they're things you can watch and do. Their coherence is based on larger schema, what we might call meta-ethical schema, which is the purpose of this book. But when we talk about social justice, without any sense of that schema, without any coherent community, and then tries to impose it on other communities as if that made sense. Even when we're talking about full equality and rights, you have to believe that human equality in abstract or in particular would be good for it to be meaningful in the first place. And without that, justice becomes a cipher. The unothered other. The potentiality of which you can fulfill with any projection of your own wants and imagination. Why would we want that? Even materialists, why would we want that? What would our virtues be? And then what would our justice be? Because just invoking it the way we do in social justice discourse is basically just a power dialogue. It is a Nietzschean battle for power. And this brings us to this book. Alasdair MacIntyre, Chapter 3, Emotivism, Social Content, and Social Context. After Virtue, 3rd edition. A moral philosophy, and emotivism is no exception, characteristically presupposes a sociology. For every moral philosophy offers explicitly or implicitly at least a partial conceptual analysis of the relationship of an agent to his or her reasons, motives, intentions, and actions, and in doing so generally presupposes some claim that even these concepts are embodied, or at least can be, in the real social world. Even Kant, who sometimes seems to restrict moral agency to the interrealm of the noumenal, implies otherwise in his writings on law, history, and politics. Thus, it would be generally to be a decisive refutation of a moral philosophy to show that moral agency on its own account of the matter could never be socially embodied, and It would also follow that we have not yet fully understood the claims of any moral philosophy until we have spelled out what the social embodiment would be. Some moral philosophies in the past, perhaps most, have understood this spelling out as itself a part of the task of moral philosophy. So it scarcely needs to be said, Plato and Aristotle, so indeed also Hume and Adam Smith, but at least since more, the dominant narrow conception of moral philosophy has ensured that moral philosophers could ignore this task, and as notably has the philosophical proponents of emotivism. We therefore must perform it for them. What is key to the social content of emotivism? It is in fact that emotivism entails the obliteration of any genuine distinction between manipulative and non-manipulative social relations. Consider the contrast between, for example, the Kantian ethics and emotivism on this point. For Kant, and the parallel point can be made about many early moral philosophers, the difference between a human relationship uninformed by morality and one so informed is precisely the difference between one in which each person treats the other primarily as a means to his or her own ends, and in which one treats the other as an end. To treat someone as an end is to offer them what I take to be good reasons for acting in one way rather than the other, but to leave it to them to evaluate those reasons. It is to be unwilling to influence another except by reason which that other he or she judges to be good. It is an appeal to the impersonal criteria of the validity of which each rational agent must be his or her own judge. By contrast, to treat someone as a means is to seek to make him or her an instrument of my purposes by adducing whatever influences or considerations will be ineffective on this or that occasion. The generalization of sociology and psychology of persuasion are what I shall need to guide me, not the standards of normative rationality. If emotivism is true, this distinction is illusory. For the evaluator of utterance can in the end have no point or use but the expression of my own feelings or attitudes and the transformation of those feelings and attitudes of others. I cannot generally appeal to the impersonal criteria, for there is no impersonal criteria. I may think that I so appeal, and others may think that I so appeal, but those thoughts are always to be mistakes. The sole reality of the distinctive moral discourse and the attempt of one to align to attitudes, feelings, preferences, and choices of another with its own. Others are always means, never ends. But what then would the social world look like if seen with emotive eyes or emotivist eyes? What would the social world be like if the truth of emotivism came to be widely presupposed? The general form of the answer to the question is now clear, but the social details depend in part on the nature of the particular social context. It will make a difference in what milieu and in what service, what particular specific interests of distinctions between manipulative and non-manipulation social relations have been obliterated. William Gass has suggested that it is the principal concern of Henry James to examine the consequences of the obliteration of the distinction in the lives of particular kinds of rich Europeans in A Portrait of the Lady. That the novel turns out to be an investigation, in Gaston's words, of what it means to be consumers of persons and of what it means to be a person consumed. And if that doesn't hit you in the age of social media, I don't know what would. There are logics here. Now, I have not addressed the material substrata of these logics. I've only hinted at them here in this discussion. And that's all we're getting at today. But we'll have to come back to it. Because in the age of ciphers, everyone is what you want them to be. And you can make them be anything. Is it a surprise that we have these faux Bonapartist demagogues all the time? You can project upon them what you want to hear, and they'll be vague enough that you can do it. They can make totally incoherent coalitions work without any trade-off, because we haven't admitted there's anything to be traded off. and we don't know who we're trading with. The simulacra of a person or a person. And if you think it's bad now, it's only going to get worse. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. I hope you enjoyed these Monday reflections. Mondays are for reflecting these days. That's my agenda now that I have other things to deal with, like writing and dealing with my health. Fridays are going to be for text, and Tuesdays for dialogue. There's more behind the Patreon wall. Sometimes you got to be your NTA. Nonetheless, if you don't need it, like and subscribe, leave a comment. Find the podcast on whatever pod server you use if you want to listen to the interviews by themselves. Great day. Protect your peace. It's important, to do that, after all.